Greetings and welcome to this Canyon Professional Development online course. This one is entitled Implications of Cultural Differences in the Classroom. I'm Daniel Egler. I'm your professor of record. I'm a vice president for academic alliances in the K-12 Educational Development Department at Grand Canyon Education. And I was formerly the president of the Association of Christian Schools International, ACSI. Some of our objectives or goals for this course are: one, I'd like you to develop an understanding of the educational need to support cultural sensitivity. Two, understand a theoretical rubric based on research that provides a practical approach to seeking to understand a diversity of cultures. And three, illustrate an application of the theoretical framework with real stories of life in a multicultural, multinational school. I'd like to start off with the parable of the monkey and the fish. This is an oral tradition that comes out of Africa, and it goes like this. There was a monkey flitting around in the forest, a really good-hearted creature, and he loved his fellow creatures, and he noticed a fish that was struggling to swim upstream to try to get into a pool where it was dusk and the bugs were lighting on the water, and the fish was attempting to feed into the pool. And as he would get to a certain part of the stream, the current would suck him back down with its strength. The monkey noticed that there was a tree there right by the stream with a branch hanging down to the point that the fish would get to right before it got sucked back down with the current. So the monkey took some risk, climbed up into the tree, dangled himself out on that branch, and just as the fish got to the point where it was going to be sucked back down the stream, the monkey reached out and snatched the fish out of the stream. The monkey scrambled back up into the tree, heart filled with joy that was helping its fellow creature, and the fish was wriggling with great excitement. And the monkey noticed that there was a stretch of grass by the stream, so he got down off the tree, laid the fish out very gently by the stream on the grass, and the fish wriggled with great excitement again and slowly descended into a deep, contented sleep from which it never woke up. The moral of the story is, what may be right for somebody else in another cultural context is not right for you. As a matter of fact, an immature love can lead to harm in a cross-cultural context. So love is a language that transcends culture, but a mature love is guided by an understanding of the cultural context. And so what we want to do is we want to explore a rubric for looking at different cultural values as it applies to the classroom setting, so that you can develop a mature love that can really impact your students in a powerful way to foster learning. Carl Glickman is a well-known educational researcher, and he talks about mature or master teachers. And when he refers to master teachers, he says there's two indications that illustrate master teachers, or that are endemic to master teachers. One of them is a desire to improve and get better. So just that desire to improve and get better is really important when you get into this master teacher category. The second one is to pause and be reflective, and to be self-critical, and to allow for input in order to change your teaching behavior. You can have a teacher that's taught for 30 years, and if they don't allow themselves to be self-critical and to change, they just become calcified dinosaurs where they never continue to improve, whereas a master teacher is always looking to continue to improve. So this is the principle here in place, to develop a mature love as a master teacher so you can continue to improve, particularly when you have a multinational student body that you're working with in the classroom. So here's some questions to ask yourself along these lines when you're attempting to improve. How do I respond to differences? Am I an annoyance to my students? Do I even know? Is it really a matter of right and wrong, biblical truth, or just difference? Am I getting to know and understand my students' cultural background? Do I look for ways to incorporate them into the classroom? And how can I maximize the learning potential of my students? Let's go back to the really matter of right and wrong or biblical truth to illustrate perhaps some of the nuances that can take place. So this is a story that comes out of my experience. I was working globally in an international Christian school in Quito, Ecuador, called the Alliance Academy. We had 27 different nationalities in our school. And as a Christian school, it was a faith-based approach to education. So in our middle school, we had a Taiwanese brother and sister that were twins. And they had never heard about Christianity, and they were taking a Bible class. And in that Bible class, there was the concept of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bowing before idols as a principle of integrity, of not forsaking their belief that they believed in the one true God. One of the students, the girl that was the twin in this Taiwanese family, had come to a personal decision to become a Christian, to become a Christ follower. And so when she heard this story, she went to the Bible teacher and said, listen, in our family, my parents at a certain time of the year asked me to bow down to my ancestors, the ones that have gone on and passed on before us, to bow down and honor them. And I want to know, as a Christ follower, as a Christian, is that compromising myself like Daniel refused to do? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they were thrown into the fiery furnace. In other words, should I bow down when my parents asked me to do that? That was quite a conundrum. So the Bible teacher came and talked to me about it. We actually went and talked to Taiwanese pastors in the community to see what they would say. The interesting thing on that is, in Chinese, there is a principle that actually the symbol can be interpreted. The symbol of sin can be interpreted as disobedience to father. So there is a very high value of respect for authority, particularly respect for the patriarchal authority as the father. And so these students were 12 or 13 years old. And so we advised them to go ahead and honor their father, because this really wasn't idolatry. It was honoring their ancestors and honoring their parents without worship and believing that they were worshiping the one true God. It's just an example as a master teacher being confronted with a cross-cultural ethical dilemma, seeking advice and being with humility to try to find out what would be the proper approach. So these are some really good questions to ask yourself when you're working in a multicultural classroom. I'm going to talk about a theory here. The author is named Geert Hofstede. He's a Dutchman, and he wrote a book called Culture and Organization: Software of the Mind. He was hired by IBM in their heyday when they had offices all over the world, and they had 50 different offices in different countries with leaders that were sent out from the United States to run these operations. So they hired Geert Hofstede to then develop a framework to help these leaders in addressing these multinational offices and how they could work as a healthy and functioning business. He came up with 4 basic problems that are shared by human societies: social inequality, relationships with authority, group solidarity, individuals in relationship to groups, ways of dealing with uncertainty relating to the control of aggression and expression of emotions, and then gender roles, concepts of dealing with masculinity and femininity, and the social implications of being born a boy or a girl. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this theoretical framework that Geert Hofstede designed and wrote about, and we're going to apply it to a multinational classroom. We've got multiple cultures in the classroom in terms of how this impacts your teaching. So what Geert would say is that inequality exists in any society that cannot be avoided. The question is, how is this handled within society? So one of the things we're going to look at is this concept of power distance. This refers to the extent to which the less powerful persons in a society accept inequality in power and consider it as normal. And again, inequality exists within any culture, but the degree of it that is tolerated varies from one culture to another. So there's some questions that most cultures ask, or that Geert would ask when he would look at a culture in terms of exploring this power distance. He said, how frequently does the following occur where employees are afraid to express disagreement with their managers, or subordinates' perception of their boss's actual decision-making style, or their subordinates' preference for their boss's decision-making style? there's a wide variance of differences between cultures in terms of this power distance. So let me give you some example. There's there's a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum are what we call small power distance cultures. These are cultures that are more egalitarian, value personal initiative and independence, spontaneity, and respect for all people, regardless of age, position, etc. And these are most exemplified by U.S. and Western societies. And then we would have large power distance cultures, and these cultures stress absolute authority, value conformity and harmony, tradition, and respect for authority and age. Now, we're not trying to assign value to this. This is simply what is and how we can understand where people are coming from when they look at these inequalities that all societies have. So, in terms of small power distance cultures, we're going to give an illustration here in the educational setting. There's an emphasis on the pursuit of truth, which can in principle be obtained from any reliable source. And there's a student-centered education emphasis with a premium on initiative. Whereas in large power distance culture, there's an emphasis on personal wisdom, which is transferred in the relationship with the teacher. And then there's a teacher-centered education with a premium on order. So in small power distance cultures, there's a limited dependence of subordinates on bosses. There's a preference for consultation, the interdependence between boss and subordinate, and the emotional distance is small and subordinates will readily approach or disagree with the boss. Whereas in high power distance cultures, there is considerable dependence on subordinates on bosses. They tend to prefer directive decision-making, large emotional distance, and unlikely to approach and contradict the boss directly. So in South America, where I was working, there's this idea of the patron concept, where the boss takes care of the employees. And also this concept of saving face, where they don't want to embarrass the boss in any way. So as an example, as the head of the school, I had probably 75 Ecuadorian employees. And so we set up a loan policy where they could take out a loan on their paychecks if there was an emergency that came up. And so that was very widely received, well received by the employees. They loved that. The problem was, as time went on, I was being asked for exceptions to the loan policies. And the exceptions became the rule rather than the exception. And I was getting more and more frustrated as a Western boss that I was constantly being asked for exceptions to the loan policy. And finally, I asked one of my trusted Ecuadorian employees what was going on. And he told me, listen, you're the patron. And the idea is we give you loyalty for you then to support us in any way that we need. And so the expectation is, with our loyalty, we then are permitted to ask for exceptions because you're supposed to care for us. Whereas in a small power distance culture, we would expect that with dialogue, we agree on a policy, and then my expectation is you're going to follow that policy. So I had to understand the nuances of this patron concept within a high power distance culture or large power distance culture. In small power distance cultures, teachers expect students to initiate communication. Teachers expect students to find their own way with some coaching. Students are allowed to speak up spontaneously in class. You can raise your hand and teacher will call on you. Students are allowed to contradict or question a teacher in class. That's called critical thinking. Large power distance cultures, students are expected the teacher to initiate communication. Students expect the teacher to outline paths to follow, much more directive in terms of counseling and consulting. Students speak up in class only when invited by the teacher, and the teacher is never contradicted nor publicly questioned. So for instance, I would have Ecuadorian teachers teaching our Spanish class because we also wanted them to teach the culture and history of Ecuador. And they would have notes written in 4 different colors and would expect the students every day, 5 days a week, simply to take notes with no dialogue. One year, a student noticed the teacher did not put a tilde, it's a symbol on a Spanish word, raised his hand, Teacher called on him and he pointed out that she had made a mistake and not marking the tilde. The teacher was highly offended, sent the student to me for discipline for disrespect. And I remember meeting with this American student saying, why are you sent to the office? And he honestly said, I don't know. I really don't know, doctor. I don't know why I'm here. And he was being very honest. I go back to the teacher and find out what's going on. And she tells me, listen, he was disrespectful because he pointed out that I missed the tilde on the word. It was an aha moment for me. See, the teacher or the student was operating from a small power distance perspective and wanting to point out to the teacher, hey, listen, I just noticed you made a mistake there. The teacher was operating from a large power distance perspective, and the teacher has never contradicted or publicly questioned. She felt shamed in front of the entire class by him pointing out that mistake. Some other things in terms of a small power distance perspective, learning is facilitated by two-way communication in class through class discussion and questioning. Teachers are often treated as friends outside of class. In teacher-student conflicts, parents are often or expected to side with the student. Younger teachers are often more popular than older teachers. Whereas in large power distance cultures, learning is facilitated by the excellence of the teacher with a primary reliance on lecturing. There's deference for students in maintaining outside of class, is maintained outside of class. In teacher-to-student conflicts, parents are often or expected to side with the teacher. And then older teachers are often much more expected than younger teachers. And again, I'm not trying to say right or wrong. I'm just looking at the spectrum here of the differences between two different cultures. So when you're operating from a small power distance worldview or perspective, and you've got large power distance students in your classrooms, there can be these rubs. And that's what I'm asking you to be aware of and to understand that could be happening. So for instance, we often, I say we as an American in a small power distance educational philosophy, predicate evaluation and assessment on classroom participation. If you want to really think about that, think about how large power distance cultures value good education. They often only will participate if the teacher calls on them. So they're not going to try to raise their hand to participate in class discussions because you're not calling on them. And then we could be grading them down in terms of classroom participation, which in many ways could be discriminatory based on the perception of how culture values education. And then I gave you the illustration of a teacher being embarrassed in class by a student simply wanting to facilitate critical thinking and pointing out that he was noticing what was happening. Another very core thing with Gert Hofstede in A Distance to Power Distance is this idea of individualism versus collectivism. Every culture deals with this, the individual versus the collective. Individualism, these cultures assume that any person looks primarily after his or her own interests, as well as the interests of his or her immediate family. Collectivism, these cultures assume that any person belongs to one or more tight in-groups from which that he or she cannot detach himself, and then the in-group, the extended family or clan, protects its members' interests and expects permanent loyalty. And this is often Latin America and Asia. So I want to highlight this a little bit in terms of individualism. Gert had 50 different cultures on his graph in terms of the spectrum. It was interesting because the United States was far and away, even almost off the chart in terms of the priority it put on individualism. So this is something that there can really be some tension in the classroom because of the priority we put as kind of a frontier mentality of individualism in the United States versus a collectivism mentality if you've got immigrant families or refugee families or families that have this as their cultural tradition coming from Latin America and Asia. So let's unpack this a little bit and talk about it. So Individualistic societies, the education places greater value on truth as contemporary or a recent research finding. Individual students will speak up in class in response to the general invitation from the teacher, and the face consciousness or the need to save face is weak. In collectivist societies, education places much greater value on truth that is rooted in tradition. Individual students will only speak on class when called upon personally by the teacher. Neither the teacher nor any student should ever be made to lose face. So I want to share a little bit of an illustration here in terms of just the difference between individualism and collectivism generally. So again, as I showed, we had some Taiwanese families in our school, and one particular family that two brothers that were with a family that were quite wealthy. They owned a chain of sports stores or sporting goods stores throughout the country of Ecuador. And they were investing this because the eventual goal was to then immigrate to the United States or Canada. But they had the boys in our school to get a Western education that was accredited and recognized in the United States and Canada so that the kids could go to a US or Canadian university. Well, right as they were entering their senior year, the father informed the boys that they were going to immigrate to Toronto. And I remember one of the boys was a soccer player. I was a soccer coach, and he was going into his senior year, was looking forward to the season and having a starting position, and had a lot of really close friends among the student body. And he came in heartbroken that he was going to miss out on his senior year. So I asked him, I said, Chen Wei, did you talk to your dad about this? And he just looked at me and he said, no, I can't. I go, why not? He goes, because if I ask him about this, it will be perceived as disloyal, and it could be perceived that I'm shaming him, causing him to lose face, because this has been a family goal. I just can't talk to him. So I wrestled with it and wasn't quite sure because I could just see the heartache that Chen Wei had. So finally I called Chen Wei in. I said, Chen Wei, how about if I tell your dad? And he looked at me and said, would you please do that? I said, but what I want to do is when I talk to your dad, I want you there with me in the conversation. So he's willing to do it. So he talked to his dad, and he had his dad come in and meet with me in the principal's office. And so I met with Chen Wei as his father. So I remember looking at Chen Wei's dad, and I explained to him what his son wanted. And I said, he really has connected. He's made some great friends. He's really looking forward to the soccer season and other things for his senior year. And Mr. Liao just wants you to understand that we can prepare him for enrollment into a Canadian university because we have a highly ranked education. This would be a great experience for him. And he can live either in one of our dormitories. We had dorms on campus for boarding students, or we can arrange to have him live with a friend or a family member. Mr. Liao sat really quietly, and then a really interesting thing. He turned and spoke to Chen Wei directly and asked his son, Chen Wei, is this really what you want? And I'll never forget that tender moment when Chen Wei said, yes, Dad, I'd really like to stay here for my senior year. And then they embraced and really connected because Dad had a soft, tender heart and wanted to honor his son. It was interesting because 6 months later, right after the first semester, Chen Wei comes into my office really upset again. I said, Chen Wei, what's the problem? He said, you know what, Dr. Egler, I just feel like my dad really misses me and I miss the family. So I'm just feeling like I need to go to Toronto over Christmas and just enroll in a Canadian high school because I really want to honor my parents and I miss my family. And I said, Chen Wei, if that's really what you want to do, that is totally, we can do that. We can get your transcript ready and get into a Canadian university. And sure enough, that's what he ended up doing. But the opportunity to connect dad and son was really powerful, but he had to understand this collectivistic perspective on the value that is put on authority and structure. The other thing in terms of some of these things, in terms of an individualistic and a collective society, You look on education placing a greater value on truth that is contemporary or recent research finding. If you look at it, for instance, when you're writing a doctoral dissertation, when I was writing it and I'm doing my review of literature, you want to find research that is current as possible, maybe within the last 5 years, so that it's up to date when you're studying a problem or you're trying to propose a thesis. It's interesting in collectivist societies, they're saying, oh, 5 years, that's nothing. We're looking at 200, 300 years, 1,000 years in terms of real wisdom that has been tested by time. That has much greater value in terms of truth than recent research. So you can understand the difference there in terms of a collectivist perspective and an individualistic perspective. I remember one year I was teaching history, social studies, and we were doing current events. This kind of dates me a little bit. It was the height of tension between the former Soviet Union and the United States. Ronald Reagan was president, and he made this big speech about tearing down the wall between West Germany and East Germany, and how communism wasn't going to last. And they were in the middle of negotiations for nuclear proliferation, reducing nuclear arms. And so I was having students doing their current event reports on that. And I had a Japanese student in my class, a very good student. And he was also on the soccer team. And so our current events were on Friday, and it was a first period class. So I was teaching one class as the principal, it was first period. And Yuji wasn't there to give his report, this Japanese student. And I thought, that's interesting, because he didn't show up as missing. And I looked out in the locker area, and there, sure enough, there he was for second, third, fourth period, following throughout the day. I thought, you got to be kidding me. Yuji has cut a class with the principal. So I called Yuji in to have a conversation with him. Really interesting, very respectful again, wanting to save face. He bows down when I asked him, and I said, Yuji, why did you cut my class? And Yuji said, Dr. Egler, I did this research for this report, and I didn't want to embarrass you in front of the class. I go, what do you mean? He goes, I went and talked to my dad about this, and our family lives in Hiroshima. And I realized when I was doing the report that the United States is the only nation that has ever used nuclear weapons on a civilian population. And I had a hard time understanding how the Soviet Union can trust the United States. Well, immediately, I was taken aback by that as an American. And then I realized, number one, Yuji was trying to honor me because he knew that would be hard for me to hear. Number two, can I hear this from a Japanese perspective? Because history is always written from the side of the winner. And we have our reasons why we use the nuclear bomb, and it's from our perspective. But what's the Japanese side? And the Japanese side is that we use nuclear weapons on a civilian population. And could I humble myself to listen to Yuji's perspective? So again, how Yuji responded, he was responding as a collectivist. Neither the teacher nor any student should ever be made to lose face. And I thanked him for that and gave him the opportunity then to give his report later on without any penalty for missing my class, because his ultimate intention was to not have me lose face. Again, in terms of individualistic societies, education is a way of improving one's economic worth and self-respect based on ability and competence. Diploma certificates have less symbolic value. We put much more value on transcripts rather than a diploma. Teachers are expected to be strictly impartial. In collectivist society, education is a way of gaining prestige in one's social environment and of joining a higher status group. Diploma certificates are important and displayed on walls, and teachers are expected to give preferential treatment to some students. It was interesting. I had one of my history teachers that married an Ecuadorian while he was teaching there in South America. And he was setting up his classroom for the first day of school. And he said his wife was helping him do that. She took all his diplomas, his undergraduate diplomas, master's degree, his teaching certification, had them all proudly displayed right on the wall behind his desk. And he was kind of embarrassed. He was like, that's a little bit ostentatious. You need to take that down. She goes, no, you need to have that up there. And they got into a little bit of their first argument as a young couple, because from his perspective, that really doesn't have any symbolic value, and that is more ostentatious. From her perspective, it's really important to have those diploma certificates displayed on walls, almost like a doctor in an individualistic culture, to validate your expertise. So again, individualistic versus collectivistic. The other thing is we actually had to establish policy on accepting of gifts, particularly from Asian parents, because they would give gifts to show their appreciation for teachers working with their students. And that often is done also because there is this expectation that you can give preferential treatment to students. You don't have to be totally impartial. So they want to make sure that their student is treated well. While from an individualistic society perspective, you're supposed to be strictly impartial. So it's almost viewed as bribing from an American perspective or US perspective. So we set up policies in order to navigate that tricky difference in value systems between two different cultural perspectives. The third pillar here that Gerd Hofstede talks about is uncertainty avoidance. And this refers to the extent to which members of a culture feel threatened by uncertain or unknown situations. It's really interesting. Any of you that have traveled globally, you can see this in terms of driving. Driving is a really good illustration of how cultures handle this type of uncertainty avoidance. In an American culture, we have what we call low uncertainty avoidance. These cultures are more self-directive, value self-actualization, or less structure, accepting of personal disagreement, and are relatively tolerant. That's Greece. And there's high uncertainty avoidance cultures. These cultures are more active, aggressive, emotional, compulsive, society-seeking, and intolerant. Probably the easiest way to do this using driving as an illustration is high uncertainty avoidance. In the United States, if you're driving in the middle of the night and there's a red light, there's the expectation that you're going to stop until that light turns green, whether or not there's traffic around you. Whereas in a low uncertainty avoidance culture, if that red light happens and it's the middle of the night, midnight, and there's nobody around you, you could just drive right through it. That red light is just a suggestion, not a rule. And I had a young lady that grew up in Africa, which has a much more low uncertainty avoidance. If you ever drive in some of the big cities in Africa, you know what this is like with the honking and the traffic jams. And people not seeming to obey any rules at all, and it's all fluid. She came to the United States and she was gotten her driver's license and was driving on a rural road, and a school bus stopped and put out the stop sign. She was behind the school bus and she looked around and she didn't see any ongoing traffic. So she just went to the other lane, went around the school bus. Lo and behold, she gets a ticket, gets called to court, and told in court that she had broken the law. And she tried to defend herself, said, well, there was no traffic. And so I felt like, you know, I was just being, I wasn't being dangerous at all. And the judge said, of course, you broke the law and you drove around a school bus with the stop sign out. And she was just flabbergasted, because she said she had people in there that were dealing drugs and these types of things, and they got the same kind of sentence that she got because she broke that law of driving past a stop sign on a school bus. I also had a family in the other direction that in Ecuador, they had these redondos, these traffic circles. And so what you do is you get into the traffic circle, lots of traffic in both directions, and you're supposed to judge when there's a gap, and you look at the size of your car compared to the other car. You make eye contact with the other driver, and then you try to navigate that implicitly as to when you move into the traffic circle. So a new driver coming from the United States just couldn't figure out how to do this. And we had a facetious expression. The definition of a nanosecond is when honking starts behind you and you missed a gap in terms of the traffic circle. Well, this is extremely stressful for this husband and this family. So finally, that year, ironically, the Ecuadorian government took out the traffic circle and put in traffic lights. They probably had 10 accidents the first day because, again, people were viewing the traffic lights as suggestions rather than rules, and they didn't know how to navigate it. So the government gave up, ripped out the traffic lights and put in the traffic circle again. And this couple from the US just couldn't deal with it. The stress became so much in terms of driving that after 6 months, he had a nervous breakdown, actually, and we had to pack him up and send him back to the United States because he could not navigate the low uncertainty avoidance just in terms of driving in a cultural setting. How does this impact education, classrooms? In low uncertainty avoidance culture, students feel comfortable in unstructured learning situations, vague objectives, broad assignments, no timetables. Teachers are allowed to say, I don't know. A good teacher uses plain language, the ability to explain complex concepts. In high uncertainty avoidance cultures, students feel comfortable in structured learning situations, precise objectives, detailed assignments, strict timetables. Teachers are expected to have all the answers. A good teacher uses academic language, the ability to demonstrate mastery of a subject. I remember my wife was teaching health class, and she had a Korean student who ended up being salutatorian, and it ended up being his only B because she didn't have structured learning situations. There were broad assignments, there wasn't timetables, and he didn't understand exactly how to navigate, like in a math class, precise objectives and strict timetables. It ended up being his hardest subject, even though he was taking AP calculus as a Korean student because he came from a high uncertainty avoidance culture. Low uncertainty avoidance students are rewarded for innovative approaches to problem solving. Teachers interpret intellectual disagreements as a stimulating experience, and teachers seek parents' ideas. High uncertainty avoidance students are rewarded for accuracy in problem solving. Think about the Singaporean math in terms of their ability in problem solving. Teachers interpret intellectual disagreements as personal disloyalty. Teachers consider themselves experts who cannot learn anything from lay parents, and the parents agree. The final one is gender roles that Gert Hofstede talks about in terms of differentiating between cultural values. This refers to the social roles associated with the two sexes, nurturing versus assertive, and in particular, the social roles attributed to men. In a masculine culture, the society in which gender roles are clearly distinct. Men are supposed to be assertive, tough, and focused on material success. Women are supposed to be more modest, tender, and concerned with the quality of life. Great illustration of that is Japan. In a feminine culture, this is a society where social gender roles overlap. Both men and women are supposed to be modest, tender, and concerned with the quality of life. And that's Sweden as an example. It's interesting because in the Korean culture and the Japanese culture, the role of the mother is being responsible for the education of their children, and often their identity is wrapped up in that. So women are supposed to be modest, tender, and concerned with the quality of life. So we had one Korean student that was a very good student, but he had social fear. So and it became increasingly stressful for him, particularly as learning English, trying to compete in an academic English-speaking environment, and then with his social anxiety. So he had two sisters and this brother, this older brother, and one of the sisters saw him with actually a shotgun in his room, and he was becoming suicidal. She was extremely concerned, came to us to tell us about it. And needless to say, it was life-threatening. So we immediately got him into a crisis counseling situation. And then I asked to meet with the mother because I knew the mother was responsible for the education of the children. So I asked one of the daughters to translate for me so I could talk to the mother directly. And it was just a very difficult conversation because when I shared with the mother, then she just went off and was yelling at me in Korean. And I asked the daughter what she was saying, and the daughter just said, "I'm sorry, Dr. Engel, I can't really share," because she used words that I don't want to translate for. And See, what was happening is her identity was being questioned because her son was struggling. And so I was caught in a dilemma. How do I handle that? The identity of the mom, but the son really needed help. So finally, I got the help of a Korean pastor to talk to the mother. And I just said, listen, in this situation, I can't compromise. I'm asking you to trust me, please. We'll keep it confidential and quiet. You won't be shamed in the community, but I need to get your son some help, some counseling help. So we had 2 full-time therapeutic counselors on staff. I got him into counseling, and he worked through this social anxiety and his depression, and the son flourished. He graduated with honors, got accepted to Boston University, and I'll never forget, after his graduation and the entire class, I went back to my office. It was late at night after the graduation ceremony, and there was a bouquet of a dozen roses, and handwritten note in broken English was from that mother thanking me for saving her son. So the sensitivity of understanding what the expectation was for the mom was critical in dealing with this family and getting help for the son. And that's very common in Japanese and Korean societies, particularly. In masculine societies, in terms of gender roles, teachers openly praise good students. Teachers use the best students as the norm, and the system rewards students' academic performance. In feminine societies, teachers avoid openly praising students. Teachers use average students as the norm, and the system rewards students' social adaptation. One year, we had a whole group of Swedish students that enrolled in our schools, and their family was working with a development project with the Ecuadorian government, the Swedish families and the parents. So this one particular Swedish student was a brilliant kid, but he was only getting a C in some of his classes. So I called the dad in to talk about it and talk about how his son was underachieving. And the one question his dad wanted to know was whether or not his student was adapting to the culture. Was he making friends? Was he adjusting well? I said, yeah, but he's not doing well academically. He says, well, I'm not concerned about that. How is my student adapting? That was so fascinating to me, as the opposite of what a Japanese or a Korean or a Taiwanese parent would want. He wanted to know how his son was adapting. The interesting thing is that boy graduated and today is one of the top level diplomats for Sweden. So getting C's in high school, but his social adaptation was far more important than the grades that he got. And he thrived when he went back to Sweden. In masculine society, they really focus on a student's failure in school. It's a severe blow to his or her self-image and may in extreme places lead to suicide. So you'll see in Japan and Korea, this academic achievement is critical. Students admire brilliance in teachers. Students compete with each other in class. Students try to make themselves visible because it's highly competitive. In feminine societies, the student's failure in school is a relatively minor incident. Students admire friendliness in teachers. Students practice mutual solidarity with each other, and students try to behave modestly. In masculine societies, corporal punishment is occasionally considered beneficial. Students choose academic subjects in view of career opportunities, and male students avoid traditionally feminine academic subjects. In feminine societies, corporal punishment is severely rejected, and students choose academic subjects in view of intrinsic interest. And male students may choose traditionally feminine academic subjects. Got an illustration of this. I had a top flight Taiwanese student again. Their family owned a shrimp farm on the coast of Ecuador. They had 3 children, but they could only afford to send one to a highly academic English-speaking Western school. So they sent the oldest son to our school, and he lived with an uncle and then attended our school. Well, his dad and the family expected him to focus on science and math because the idea that he was going to become an engineer, a traditionally masculine career path. Well, Tony was a great athlete, was a goalkeeper for me, and he loved working with kids. So he was a volunteer coach for the elementary school and felt like, man, I should just be an elementary school teacher. That's what I really wanted to do. But he had this expectation of the family and the dad, especially in terms of what he was going to go into. And he knew the sacrifice the family was making for him to succeed. As he got up into higher levels of mathematics, he got into trigonometry and then into calculus. And he began to struggle because that was not his gifting. So the first quarter of his senior year, he got a D in calculus. And he knew that his dad and his mom were coming up to check and see how he was doing on his report card. And so what he did is he got the report card, he drew a little line in the D to make it a B. And he would show that, he showed that to his parents. Well, the dad noticed that it was changed. He asked his son about it, and Tony admitted to it. But then they got into an argument because Tony shared with his dad how he wanted to really be a teacher. He didn't want to be an engineer. The argument got more and more heated until finally it became physical, and Tony actually punched his dad. And I'll never forget Mom coming into my office with Tony, visibly shaken, white, describing what was happening, just worried that they couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And sure enough, they didn't. It fractured the family, fractured the son and the dad's relationship. Tony did end up graduating. He went on to university and ended up becoming a teacher. But that dad and son relationship was never fully restored. That was my first illustration of some of these family values that were projected onto students, and to navigate that carefully. So if you remember the Chen Wei story with another Taiwanese family on how I had learned, and I brought the dad in with the son to help them navigate this, because they were being educated in a Western school where these sons were being taught to think critically and to speak for themselves. And they would go home to more traditional families where you're not supposed to speak out. You're not supposed to embarrass anybody. You're supposed to respect authority. And it was difficult for the students to navigate that. They were being taught one way, to think critically and to speak up and to question, and they were being taught at home not to question and to just honor tradition and authority. And that ended up becoming one of the emphases that I had to learn, and our counseling department had to learn, that that was going to be tension that could potentially happen in a family. So I've always regretted that I was too immature in my perspective and understanding that I could not step in and help this family navigate that. It was a tremendous learning opportunity for me that didn't matter the amount of love I had. If it didn't understand the cultural context, I couldn't help, and I could potentially do some damage. So that's my encouragement to you. Out of a mistake that I made or something that I could have done better, I want you to be reflective and to consider some of these 4 elements when dealing with different cultures and different families in your multicultural classroom. So as we close our Canyon Professional Development Department, our why is to empower, educate, and inspire our community so they take action to fulfill their purpose and to serve others. And I hope this course fits into that purpose. There's free professional development. You can look at this on our channel, or you can scan this code and you can get some help that way. There's PD on demand, low cost, and it's individualized with our Canyon PD Solutions to Go. You're taking this course within that framework. I'd encourage you to look at some of the other courses that we have available as well. Thank you for listening in. Here's some of my references. This is this Pilgrimage to Serverhood, where that story of the monkey and the fish came from. And then Hofstede, that's his book, With Culture and Software and Organization Software of the Mind. Thank you for listening in, and I trust this is going to be really helpful for you. Bye-bye.